In the gilded heart of 9th century Baghdad, the Persian spymaster and geographer Ibn Khordadbeh compiled a remarkable book of maps and travelogues. Buried within its pages, he describes a mysterious group of Jewish merchants he calls the Radhanites. In a cool, matter-of-fact tone, he lays out their 4 great trade routes, which together formed a network of truly global scale. He details journeys that began in the river valleys of France, crossed the hostile frontiers of empires, and terminated in the palaces of India and the Tang dynasty of China. This single passage presents an astonishing historical paradox. How, in a fractured world defined by the supposedly impassable barrier between Christianity and Islam, could a single group of merchants operate with such freedom and reach? Who were these enigmatic traders who treated the borders of hostile superpowers as mere lines on a map? This is the story of the Radhanites, the secret brokers of the Dark Ages, and the hidden economic network that held their fragmented world together. It is the story of how they became the indispensable, invisible wiring of their age. The 9th century was a world cleft in two. It was dominated by a great geopolitical and ideological rivalry, a civilizational Cold War that bisected the known world. In the west stood the Christian Carolingian Empire, the sprawling realm forged by Charlemagne and governed by his heirs. It was a world forged in the image of a restored Rome, a land-based, feudal power defined by its shared faith and its deep-seated hostility to the Islamic world. Its armies fought a near-constant frontier war against the Caliphate's forces in Spain and Sicily, and its theologians preached of a clear, righteous divide between the Christian Commonwealth and the lands of the infidel. For the courts of Aachen and Paris, the world beyond the Mediterranean was a place of profound danger and spiritual darkness. In the east, the Abbasid Caliphate represented the other half of humanity. Vast, sophisticated, and urbanized, its center of gravity was the magnificent metropolis of Baghdad. This was the heart of a global economic system, a hub of science and commerce whose influence stretched from the Atlantic to the borders of China. To the caliphs and their courtiers, the Christian kingdoms of the Franks were a remote and primitive backwater, a land of forests and crude warriors, spiritually lost and intellectually barren. Direct, state-to-state diplomacy was rare and fraught with suspicion. A Christian merchant entering Baghdad without the caliph's explicit protection was not a trader, he was a spy. A Muslim caravan in the heart of Francia was not a commercial venture, it was an invasion in miniature. This great divide created an immense economic vacuum. The political and military hostility made direct trade between the two superpowers all but impossible, yet the desire for it had never been greater. The land-rich but cash-poor aristocracy of the Carolingian court craved the symbols of status and power that only the East could provide. They yearned for the shimmering silks of China, the exotic spices of India and the Moluccas, and the potent perfumes and medicines of Persia. These were not mere luxuries. They were the essential currency of power, the ultimate diplomatic gifts, and the visible proof of a ruler's legitimacy. Conversely, the sophisticated markets of the Abbasid Caliphate had their own powerful demands. They needed a steady supply of the high-quality, pattern-welded steel swords forged in the Rhineland, the legendary Frankish blades that were the envy of the world. They sought the dense, warm firs of the northern forests and the strong, straight timber of European trees for their shipbuilding. And most grimly, the insatiable demand of the Caliphate for servants, soldiers, and concubines created a massive market for a particular European export: human beings. The vast, disorganized Slavic lands to the east of the Carolingian Empire were a constant, tragic source of slaves. The demand was there, the supply was there, but the bridge between them was broken. Who could possibly cross this divide? Who could operate in a world that demanded you be either Christian or Muslim, Frank or Saracen? The answer was a group of merchants who were, by a unique accident of history, neither. They were a third party, a people apart, uniquely positioned to become the ultimate neutral intermediaries. These were the Jewish merchants known as the Radhanites. Rooted in ancient communities that predated the rise of both Christianity and Islam, they were a people of a global diaspora. While a Christian merchant from France had no trusted agent in Cairo, a Radhanite did. While a Muslim trader from Baghdad had no reliable contact in the court of Louis the Pious, a Radhanite did. Their shared faith, their common legal framework, and their ancient network of kinship and trust provided a private, encrypted communications and banking system that spanned the entire civilized world. This documentary will follow the roots of these secret brokers. We will trace their 4 great journeys, as described by Ibn Khordadbeh, across a hostile and divided world. We will catalog the precious and often brutal goods they carried, from silks and spices to swords and slaves. We will argue that these enigmatic traders were more than just merchants. They were the essential synapses of a fractured world brain, the sole conduit for not just luxury goods, but for technology, information, and ideas. They were the hidden wiring of a supposedly dark age, and their story proves that even in an era of profound division, the threads of commerce are powerful enough to hold the world together. To comprehend the genius of the Radhanites, one must first stand in the shadow of the wall they learned to traverse. The world of the 9th century was not a global village. It was a planet cleaved in two. A civilizational iron curtain, forged not of steel but of faith and steel's brutal application, had descended across the Mediterranean, partitioning the known world into 2 vast, hostile, and almost entirely separate spheres of influence. This was not a simple rivalry between kingdoms, it was a cold war between universes. In the West, there was Christendom, newly and fragilely consolidated under the heirs of the Frankish Emperor Charlemagne. In the East, there was the Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, governed by the immensely powerful and sophisticated Abbasid Caliphate from their magnificent capital of Baghdad. They were the 2 superpowers of their age, each regarding the other with a potent mixture of fear, contempt, and profound, self-righteous ignorance. The ideological gulf between them was as wide and treacherous as any ocean, and the idea of routine, peaceful interaction was, to most, an absurdity. The Carolingian West was a world reinventing itself from the rubble of a fallen empire. It was a civilization built on land and loyalty, a society whose rhythms were dictated by the seasons, the harvest, and the call to war. Its power was decentralized, a complex feudal pyramid of oaths and obligations that bound warriors to their lords and lords to their king or emperor. Its intellectual life was centered in the monastery, its spirit was martial, and its economy was overwhelmingly agrarian. The great cities of the Roman past had shrunk into shadows of their former selves, and its trade networks were largely localized and primitive. Having been cut off from the great silver and gold mines of the ancient world, it was, as we have seen, a cash-poor society. Wealth was tangible, measured in the acreage of a farm, the number of fighting men a lord could muster, or in crude, chopped-up pieces of recycled Roman silver. Yet, despite this seeming primitivism, the Carolingian world was a powerhouse of specific resources, a producer of raw materials and specialized goods that were, ironically, of the highest quality and in great demand elsewhere. The first of these resources was the seemingly endless forest that covered most of Western Europe. This was the source of 2 vital commodities: timber and furs. The old-growth oak and fir of the Frankish and Germanic lands were straight, strong, and ideal for the construction of buildings, and especially ships, a resource that the increasingly deforested heartlands of the Middle East were beginning to lack. Deeper within these forests roamed the animals, whose pelts were the soft gold of the age. The marten, the beaver, and the fox provided the dense, warm furs that were a necessity for survival in the cold, damp halls of a European lord, but a supreme luxury in the markets of the East. The second great resource was mineral. The river valleys of the Rhine produced some of the finest iron ore in the world, and the smiths of Francia had perfected the difficult and secretive art of pattern welding. By twisting and hammering together rods of hard and soft iron, they created blades of legendary quality, the Frankish swords, or Ulfberth, which possessed a combination of strength and flexibility that was the envy of every warrior who faced them. They were, in essence, the high technology of their day. The third, and most tragic, of the West's great exports was human. To the east of the Carolingian Empire, stretching from the Baltic to the Balkans, lived a vast and diverse array of Slavic peoples. Politically fragmented and frequently at war with one another and their powerful neighbors, they became the great, tragic reservoir of the European slave trade. Frankish and Saxon lords would mount raids or razzias into these lands, not for territory, but for captives. The constant state of intertribal warfare among the Slavs themselves also produced a steady supply of prisoners of war, who were sold to brokers at frontier markets. These captives were a renewable resource, a steady flow of human chattel that represented a major source of potential wealth. But for all its raw, powerful resources, the Carolingian world suffered from a profound and debilitating poverty of luxury. The aristocrats and kings who governed this world were starved for the goods that signified their status. Their halls were rough-hewn and smoky, their clothes were of wool and linen, and their food was seasoned with local herbs. They craved the goods they knew from scripture and from the half-forgotten tales of Rome. They needed spices, pepper, cloves, and cinnamon to preserve their food and to display their wealth at the feasting table. They needed the fragrant resins of musk and camphor to create perfumes that could mask the stench of their unwashed world and serve as potent medicines. Above all, they needed silk. Silk was more than a fabric, it was a political statement. A bolt of shimmering Chinese silk, brought thousands of miles from the mysterious East, was the ultimate symbol of power, the most prestigious gift a king could give to a loyal duke or a foreign ambassador. To wear silk was to wear your connection to the wider world, to display a reach and a wealth that set you apart from lesser men. The Carolingian elite had a desperate, structural need for these goods, but the path to acquiring them was blocked by a wall of faith and fire. That wall was the Abbasid Caliphate, a civilization that was the mirror image of the Carolingian West in almost every respect. It was an empire of cities and silver, a sophisticated, cash-rich, and deeply commercial society. Its capital, Baghdad, was a global metropolis, the terminus of the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean trade routes. Its markets were piled high with the very goods the Franks craved: pepper from India, cloves from the Spice Islands, camphor from Borneo, and bale upon bale of fine silk from Tang, China. Its administration was managed by a complex bureaucracy, its intellectual life was buzzing with the translated knowledge of the Greeks, and its economy was lubricated by a massive and stable supply of silver dirhams. Yet, this sophisticated world had its own set of powerful demands, its own needs that could only be met by the raw, untamed world of the north. The Abbasid elite, for all their access to silk, desired the dense, dark firs of the European forests as the ultimate symbol of status and comfort. Their armies and a growing class of urban elites sought the superior weaponry of the Frankish smiths, willing to pay a premium for a sword that would not shatter in the heat of battle. Most significantly, the very structure of Abbasid military and political power came to depend on a steady supply of slaves. The caliphs had begun to create elite armies composed not of Arab tribesmen of questionable loyalty, but of imported slave soldiers or ghilman and Mamluks. These were young men, captured from outside the borders of Islam and raised in barracks with a fanatical devotion to the caliph alone. The fair-skinned peoples of the Slavic lands and other parts of Europe were considered ideal for this purpose. Furthermore, a complex and hierarchical court society required a vast number of servants, particularly eunuchs, who could be trusted to guard the harems of the powerful. The demand for these specific types of human beings was immense, systemic, and constant. Here, then, was the great economic paradox of the 9th century. Two hostile superpowers, each viewing the other as a spiritual and military enemy, were locked in a state of profound and unrecognized economic codependence. The West had the raw materials, the swords, furs, and slaves that the East desperately wanted. The East had the luxury goods, the silk, spices, and silver that the Western elite needed to legitimize their power. They were two magnetic poles, a perfect match of supply and demand, yet they were oriented to repel each other. The border between them was a militarized frontier, a place of raids and skirmishes, not of caravans and commerce. A Frankish merchant found in Abbasid territory was a spy. A Muslim trader in the heart of Francia was an enemy. The entire political, religious, and military structure of the age seemed designed to prevent the natural and hugely profitable exchange of goods from taking place. The circuit was broken. The great economic engine of Eurasia had stalled. For the world to function, for kings and caliphs to get what they truly wanted, a secret broker was needed. A third party that belonged to neither world, a network that could operate in the shadows, that could cross the wall, and that could, for a price, complete the circuit. In the starkly divided world of the 9th century, the idea of a merchant traveling freely from the Christian heartland of Francia to the Muslim metropolis of Baghdad seems like a fantasy. An official emissary might, with immense diplomatic preparation and at great risk, make such a journey. But a private trader, laden with commercial goods, should have been an impossibility. He would have been a man without a country, a traveler with the wrong faith, the wrong language, and the wrong political allegiance in every land he entered. Yet, the Radhanites did it. They did it routinely and on a global scale. What was their secret? What passport did they possess that allowed them to pass through the checkpoints of hostile empires? The answer was not a document stamped by a king or a caliph. It was their very identity. The Radhanites were Jewish, and in the 9th century, this identity gave them a unique, paradoxical, and immensely powerful advantage. Theirs was the power of a global, trust-based network, a commercial superpower built not on territory or military might, but on the invisible, unbreakable bonds of a shared diaspora. To understand this advantage, one must first understand the unique position of the Jewish people in the early medieval world. This was an ancient community whose history stretched back long before the birth of either Christianity or Islam. They were, in a sense, the world's great survivors, a people who had learned to adapt and thrive after the loss of their national homeland. The destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in 70 CE had solidified the Jewish diaspora, scattering their communities from the ancient centers in Mesopotamia and Persia to the far-flung corners of the Roman Empire, including Spain, the Rhineland, and the valleys of France. When the Roman Empire split and fell, and later when the Arab conquests created a new global empire, these Jewish communities did not vanish. They endured. They became a permanent and integral part of the urban landscape in both the Christian West and the Islamic East. This historical reality had a profound commercial consequence. In the 9th century, a Jewish merchant setting out from the Rhone Valley in France knew that in almost every major city along his route, whether it was the Christian port of Marseille, the Muslim metropolis of Cordoba, the great Egyptian capital of Fustat, Old Cairo, or the imperial heart of Baghdad, he would find a small but established Jewish community. Upon arrival, he would not be a complete stranger in a hostile land. He could find a synagogue where he could worship, a host who understood his dietary laws, and, most importantly for business, a community of fellow merchants who were bound to him by a shared identity and a shared set of rules. This was the Radhanites' secret weapon, a global network of trusted agents. The power of this network was built on three foundational pillars. The first was a common language. While a Radhanite merchant would have been a polyglot, fluent in the languages of the lands he traded in Arabic, Persian, Frankish, Slavic, the community shared a sacred and scholarly language, Hebrew. This was their private, encrypted channel of communication. A merchant in Rouen could write a letter of introduction or a commercial contract in Hebrew and be confident that his agent in Baghdad could read and understand it perfectly. This linguistic bond facilitated complex, long-distance coordination in a way that no other group could replicate. A Frankish merchant could not easily communicate with a Byzantine one. They were separated by a linguistic as well as a political gulf. The Radhanites faced no such barrier. The second pillar was a shared legal framework. Jewish communities across the world were governed by the principles of Talmudic law. This was a sophisticated legal system that had been developed over centuries, and it contained detailed regulations concerning contracts, partnerships, loans, and letters of credit. A dispute between two Radhanite merchants, one in Mainz and the other in Alexandria, could be adjudicated by a local rabbinical court, Beth Din, in either city, with both parties recognizing the court's authority and its legal precedence. This created an environment of extraordinary commercial trust. A Radhanite could confidently enter into a partnership with an agent on the other side of the world, knowing that they were both playing by the same rules and that there were established, reliable mechanisms for resolving any disputes. This Talmudic economy was a private international system of commercial law that was centuries ahead of the fragmented and localized legal codes of the Christian West. The third and most crucial pillar was the simple, profound bond of mutual reliance. As a minority group in both Christendom and Islam, Jewish communities had learned that their survival and prosperity depended on sticking together. They were often tolerated but rarely fully integrated, a status that fostered a powerful sense of internal cohesion. A visiting Radhanite merchant was not just a business associate, he was a vital source of news, a carrier of letters, and a link to the wider Jewish world. To cheat him or harm him would be to betray one's own community and to damage the very network upon which everyone's livelihood depended. This created a level of trust that was the envy of other traders. In an age where long-distance trade was fraught with peril and fraud, the ability to entrust a fortune's worth of goods to an agent in a distant city, confident that he would not simply vanish with the profits, was an almost magical advantage. The very name Radhanite is a mystery that may point to their origins and the nature of their network. The 9th century Persian author Ibn Khordadbeh is our only primary source for the name itself. Scholars have debated its meaning for centuries. One theory suggests it comes from a district in Mesopotamia known as Radhan, pointing to a Persian origin for the group. Another compelling theory links it to the Rhone River in France, known as Rhodanus in Latin, suggesting they were based in the great trading cities of the Carolingian Empire like Lyon. A third theory proposes that the name derives from a Persian word, Ra-Dan, meaning one who knows the way. This last interpretation is perhaps the most poetic and evocative. It casts them not as a specific tribe or a people from a specific place, but as a professional guild, a fraternity of master navigators and merchants whose identity was defined by their expertise in connecting the world. Regardless of their precise origin, it is clear they were a class of highly specialized, Jewish long-distance traders who had perfected the art of using their diaspora connections as a commercial instrument. They were the living embodiment of a trust network, and in the divided world of the 9th century, trust was the most valuable and the rarest commodity of all. The single, astonishing paragraph from the Persian geographer Ibn Khordadbeh is more than just a passing mention of the Radhanites. It is a strategic blueprint, a concise but breathtaking overview of a global commercial empire. He does not speak of them in vague terms. He details their operations with the precision of an intelligence officer, laying out 4 distinct, globe-spanning routes that the Radhanites commanded. These were not simple, linear paths from point A to point B. They were a complex, multimodal, and brilliantly adaptable network, a global chessboard upon which the Radhanites were the undisputed grandmasters. Their genius was not just in undertaking these immense journeys, but in their ability to fluidly switch between them, playing the northern land route off against the southern sea route, constantly calculating the ever-shifting variables of seasonal winds, political instability, and local market conditions. To trace these 4 routes is to witness the sheer scale of their ambition and the depth of their logistical and geographical mastery. The first great route was a southern, maritime highway that leveraged the old, established sea lanes of the Roman and Persian worlds. Ibn Khordadbeh describes the Radhanites departing from the great ports of Francia, like Marseille or Arles. From there, their ships would sail east across the Mediterranean, a sea that was, in the 9th century, a dangerous and contested space, a frontier between the Christian north and the powerful Muslim navies of North Africa and Egypt. But the Radhanites, as neutral brokers, could navigate this divide. Their destination was the great port of Pelusium, Al-Farama, in the Nile Delta, the gateway to Egypt. Here, they would unload their European cargo and transfer it onto the backs of camels for the arduous overland journey to the Red Sea. This short but crucial desert crossing, from the Nile to the port of Kolzum, near modern Suez, was a critical bottleneck that they mastered. At Kolzum, they would enter the commercial world of the Indian Ocean. They would procure passage on the doughs of Arab and Persian sailors, the masters of the monsoon winds, and sail down the Red Sea, past the holy cities of Jeddah and into the rich markets of Yemen and beyond. The text describes them continuing on to Sind, in modern Pakistan, India, and all the way to the shores of Tang, China. This was a truly global maritime route, a chain of interconnected ports that linked the river valleys of France to the great trading hubs of the Far East, and the Radhanites were the indispensable thread that tied the entire chain together. The second route was a masterful hedge against the first, a demonstration of their adaptability. It also began in Francia, but instead of sailing east, the Radhanites sailed west, around the Iberian Peninsula. Their ships would pass through the Pillars of Hercules at Gibraltar, the strait that separated Al-Andalus from North Africa, and then turn east again along the coast of the Maghreb, calling at the ports of the powerful Aghlabid and Idrisid Emirates. This was a longer and often more dangerous sea voyage, but it offered a crucial advantage. It bypassed the often turbulent politics of the central Mediterranean and gave them direct access to the rich markets of Muslim Spain and North Africa. From the Syrian coast, likely at ports like Antioch or Tyre, the route became an overland journey. The merchants would join the great camel caravans that plied the ancient desert highways, traveling through Damascus to the river ports of the Euphrates like Raqqa. From there, they could take river barges down to the imperial capital of Baghdad itself. Once in Baghdad, the journey could continue. They would travel with Persian caravans through the great cities of the Silk Road Ray, Nishapur, Merv, and Bukhara, eventually crossing the formidable Pamir Mountains to reach the borders of China. This route was a complex, multimodal odyssey, a testament to their ability to seamlessly switch from ship to camel to riverboat, a logistical feat of immense complexity. The third route was an almost entirely terrestrial journey, a path that cut straight through the heart of the European and Eurasian landmass. It began, like the others, in Francia, but headed east overland. The Radhanites would travel through the lands of the Slavs, the vast, politically fragmented, and often dangerous territory that separated the Carolingian West from the organized empires of the East. This was the great reservoir of the slave trade, and the Radhanites were key players in this brutal commerce, likely establishing secure trading posts and alliances along the way. Their journey would take them to the capital of the Khazar Khaganate, the great city of Idil on the lower Volga. As we have seen with the Vikings, the Khazars were a sophisticated, Turkic trading empire that controlled the vital crossroads between Europe and Asia. For the Radhanites, the Khazars were not an obstacle, but a vital partner and a gateway. From Idil, the route split. Some merchants could take ships across the Caspian Sea to the southern shore, giving them access to the heartlands of Persia. Others could continue east overland, traveling through the lands of the Oghuz Turks, a perilous journey through the Central Asian steppe, eventually linking up with the Silk Road routes that would take them to China. This was perhaps the most arduous of the routes, a test of pure endurance and diplomatic skill, but it offered a crucial alternative if the sea lanes of the Mediterranean were closed by war or piracy. The fourth and final route was the most northerly and, in many ways, the most innovative. It also pushed east through the lands of the Slavs, but it took a more northerly track, aiming for the great river systems that the Rus Vikings were, at this very time, beginning to master. Ibn Khordadbeh's description of this route is a clear indication that the Radhanites were not just aware of the nascent Viking trade network, they were active participants in it, and likely predated the Vikings in their commercial exploitation of the region. They would have traveled alongside Rus's merchants, or perhaps used them as transporters and protectors, down the Dnieper River to the Black Sea. This would have given them access to the markets of the ultimate prize, the great Christian city of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. For other merchants, this would have been the end of the journey. But for the Radhanites, it was just another hub. From Constantinople, they could then cross the sea and link up with the overland routes to Baghdad, or sail into the Mediterranean to complete a great circular journey. This northern route shows the Radhanites at their most adaptable, leveraging the emerging power of the Vikings to create yet another pathway in their global network. Taken together, these four routes represent a global strategy of breathtaking scope. They were a portfolio of options that gave the Radhanites an unparalleled ability to navigate a dangerous world. If a war between Byzantium and the Caliphate closed the land route through Anatolia, they could switch to the sea route via Egypt. If piracy made the central Mediterranean impassable, they could sail around Spain. If the Khazar Khaganate fell into civil war, they could pivot to the Dnieper route. They were not bound to a single path. They operated with a fluid, global perspective that no king or caliph could match. They were the masters of a chessboard that spanned 3 continents, and their pieces, ships, caravans, and agents were always in motion, constantly seeking the safest and most profitable path. This network was their true empire, an empire without borders, armies, or a capital, held together only by the power of trust and an encyclopedic knowledge of the world's secret ways. The vast, globe-spanning network of the Radhanites was not an abstract exercise in geography. It was a commercial enterprise of immense profitability, a pipeline built to move specific, high-value goods from where they were plentiful to where they were desperately desired. The Radhanites were the master brokers of luxury, dealing in a catalogue of commodities that reads like a treasure list for the kings and caliphs of their age. Their genius lay in their perfect understanding of the profound economic imbalances of the 9th century world. They knew what the Carolingian court, starved of spice and silk, would pay a fortune for. And they knew what the Abbasid elite, flush with silver and hungry for the raw materials of the north, would offer in exchange. They were the architects of a great, intercontinental arbitrage, buying low in one civilization and selling high in another. To examine their cargo is to understand the very desires and necessities that powered the secret economy of the Dark Ages. The goods they carried were not just merchandise. They were the essential fuel of power, prestige, and human tragedy. The cargo flowing from west to east, from the heart of Francia to the markets of the Caliphate, was a portfolio of Europe's most potent and valuable resources. At the very top of this list were the products of the Frankish smiths, their magnificent, high-technology swords. In the forges of the Rhineland, smiths had perfected the complex and laborious technique of pattern welding, a process of twisting and forge welding together rods of high and low-carbon iron. The resulting blades, often marked with the maker's name like the famous +V LFBERH +T, possessed a combination of properties that seemed almost magical. They were incredibly strong, capable of shattering a lesser blade, yet flexible enough to bend without breaking. To the warriors of the Abbasid Caliphate, who often faced heavily armored Byzantine or nomadic foes, these Frankish swords were the ultimate military hardware, a technological advantage worth almost any price. The Radhanites, with their ability to operate in the Carolingian heartlands, became the exclusive exporters of this critical military technology, a trade that was as lucrative as it was strategically sensitive. Alongside the products of the forge came the products of the forest. The Radhanites were major players in the fur trade, tapping into the same vast reservoir of soft gold that the Vikings were also beginning to exploit. They sourced the precious pelts of marten, beaver, ermine, and black fox from the Slavic and Scandinavian lands, consolidating them and shipping them east, where they were coveted by the Abbasid elite as the ultimate symbol of status and comfort. They also traded in timber, a bulk commodity that was nonetheless of immense strategic value. The great forests of Europe provided the strong, straight oak and fir needed for shipbuilding, a resource that was becoming increasingly scarce in the more arid and heavily populated lands of the Middle East. However, the most consistent, most profitable, and most morally fraught of all the Radhanites' Western exports was their trade in human beings. The 9th century was, for all its intellectual and cultural achievements, a slave-based world, and the Radhanites were its most efficient international slave traders. The primary source of these slaves was the vast, politically fragmented Slavic territories of Eastern Europe. The Radhanites acted as brokers in a brutal supply chain. They would purchase captives from Carolingian lords who had conducted slave raids, or buy prisoners of war from warring Slavic tribes themselves. Ibn Khordadbeh's description is chillingly specific. He notes that from the west, the Radhanites brought eunuchs, male slaves, sakaliba, and slave girls. This was not an accidental byproduct of their other trade. It was a highly specialized and deliberate operation. They were supplying the caliphate's immense demand for 3 distinct types of human chattel. The slave girls were destined for the harems of the wealthy. The male slaves, the sakaliba, were prized for their strength and fair complexion and were often channeled into the caliph's elite slave armies. The trade in eunuchs was perhaps the most complex and horrific aspect of their enterprise. The great households of the Abbasid court, and indeed the caliph's palace itself, required a class of castrated male servants who could be trusted to guard the sequestered female quarters. This created a huge demand, and the Radhanites were the primary suppliers. The great center for this grim procedure was, according to multiple Arab sources, the Carolingian city of Verdun. Here, it seems the Radhanites had established a kind of horrific processing center where captive Slavic boys would be castrated and then allowed to recover before being force-marched across Europe and sold for an immense profit in the markets of Cordoba and the East. It was a brutal, industrial-scale operation that reveals the cold, pragmatic core of their business. They were not driven by sentiment, but by a precise understanding of supply and demand, even in its most tragic forms. The cargo flowing in the opposite direction, from east to west, was a mirror image of desires. It was a catalogue of the exotic, the refined, and the sensuous, the very things a rough and ready Carolingian court lacked. At the top of this list, the undisputed king of all luxury goods was silk, produced only in the far-off lands of China and Persia. Silk was a fabric of near-mythical status in the West. It was light, strong, brilliantly colored, and impossibly smooth. It was the cloth of emperors and saints. To own it was to possess a piece of a distant, more civilized world. The Radhanites, with their direct access to the terminus of the Silk Road in Baghdad, became the exclusive pipeline for this most precious of fabrics, feeding the insatiable appetite of the Frankish elite for a commodity that was the bedrock of their system of diplomatic and political gift-giving. Alongside silk came the spices that would transform the bland, salted and smoked diet of the European aristocracy. The Radhanites' southern sea route gave them direct access to the great spice ports of the Indian Ocean. From here they brought the pepper of the Malabar coast, the cinnamon of Ceylon, the cloves of the Moluccas, and the ginger of Southeast Asia. These spices were not just flavorings. They were high-status medicines and potent food preservatives, commodities so valuable they were often traded by the peppercorn. They also traded in the aromatic and medicinal treasures of the East. From the court of the Caliph, they sourced the powerful and fantastically expensive perfume of musk, derived from the glands of the Himalayan musk deer. They brought camphor from Borneo, aloes wood from Southeast Asia, and a whole pharmacopoeia of advanced drugs and balms that were unknown in the West. This two-way flow of goods represents a perfect, symbiotic relationship, a great circulatory system for the Eurasian world. The Radhanites were the heart of this system, pumping the raw, powerful commodities of the West to the East, and in return, pumping the refined, high-status luxuries of the East back to the West. They understood the desires that lay hidden in the hearts of kings and caliphs. They knew that a Frankish lord would pay a fortune in swords and slaves for a bolt of silk that would secure his prestige, and they knew that an Abbasid courtier would pay a fortune in silver for the perfect fur to line that silk. They were the masters of this global catalogue, the brokers who held the price list for their entire world. The Radhanite network was a marvel of logistical and social engineering, but it did not exist in a vacuum. It was not a self-contained system. For it to function, it had to plug into the much older, vaster, and richer economic ecosystems of the East. The western terminus of their roots in Francia was, in a sense, the frontier, the source of raw materials. The eastern terminus, In the magnificent imperial capital of Baghdad was the center of the world, the global marketplace where the true wealth of Asia was consolidated. To follow a Radhanite merchant eastward along his arduous route is to witness his transformation. He begins as a hardy pioneer, a master of rough landscapes and dangerous border crossings. He ends his journey as a sophisticated player in the most complex and lucrative commercial environment on the planet. The Radhanites' success in the East was predicated on their brilliant ability to integrate themselves into this world, to become not just traders to the caliphate, but essential participants within its vast economic sphere, acting as the final, crucial link between the ancient Silk Road and the emerging markets of a new Europe. When a Radhanite merchant finally arrived in Baghdad, after months or even years of travel, he entered a city that was the physical embodiment of global commerce. Baghdad in the 9th century was not just the political capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. It was the undisputed economic center of the world. Situated at a perfect nexus of river and caravan routes, it was a continental funnel through which the wealth of 3 continents flowed. From the north, down the Tigris and Euphrates, came the goods of the Caucasus and Eastern Europe. From the south, up the Persian Gulf and the rivers, came the maritime trade of the Indian Ocean, the spices, jewels, and exotic woods of India, Africa, and Southeast Asia. And from the east, along the Great Khorasan Highway, came the caravans of the fabled Silk Road, the oldest and most prestigious trade route in human history, carrying the most precious commodity of all, Chinese silk. The Radhanite merchant, arriving with his cargo of Frankish swords, Slavic slaves, and northern furs, was not entering a simple marketplace. He was entering a highly specialized and deeply regulated economic machine. He would have proceeded to one of the city's great souks, or markets, each dedicated to a specific trade. There was the market for textiles, the market for spices, the market for perfumes, and, grimly, the great slave markets. Here, the Radhanite was no longer a rugged frontiersman but a sophisticated wholesaler. His primary customers were not the end users, but the powerful guilds of Baghdadi merchants who controlled the city's internal economy. He would have negotiated with the heads of the furriers' guild for his pelts, with the armorers for his swords, and with the nakas, the powerful and wealthy guild of slave traders, for his human cargo. These transactions were not simple barter. They were conducted within a highly monetized and legally sophisticated framework. The Radhanite would have been paid in the caliphate's stable, high-purity silver dirhams, the universal currency of the age. He may have used a sack, a form of written check or bill of exchange, drawn on one of the city's powerful Jewish banking families, whose trust network mirrored and complemented his own. These bankers, known as jahbads, were essential players, providing the financial liquidity that lubricated the entire system. They could change currencies, issue credit, and transfer vast sums of money without the immense risk of physically transporting bullion. The Radhanite merchant was a master of this complex financial world, a world of credit and contract that was centuries ahead of the primitive cash and barter economy of the West he had departed from. Having sold his Western goods and converted them into the hard currency of the East, the Radhanite's work was only half done. Now he had to acquire the Eastern luxuries that his European clients so desperately craved. This is where he played his most crucial role, as the final distributor for the Silk Road. The caravans that arrived in Baghdad from Central Asia, laden with Chinese silk, were typically operated by Sogdian or Persian merchants who had mastered the eastern half of the Great Route. They were not interested in making the perilous journey on to Francia. Their world ended here, in the great markets of the Caliphate. Welp, winner 2 tenths. The liberalafers. Their world ended here, in the great markets of the Caliphate. The Radhanite merchant was their Western counterpart. He was the specialist who would take this precious cargo and guide it through the final, dangerous leg of its journey to the courts of Aachen and Paris. In the great silk market of Baghdad, the Souk al-Harir, the Radhanite would use his newly acquired dirhams to purchase bolts of raw silk, damasks, and brocades, selecting the specific colors and weaves that he knew, from his intimate knowledge of his clients, would fetch the highest price in the West. His shopping list extended far beyond silk. In the spice and perfume markets, he would meet with traders who had just arrived on ships from the port of Basra, their holds filled with the aromatic treasures of the Indian Ocean. Here, he would purchase the black pepper of the Malabar coast, the cloves and nutmeg from the secret spice islands of Indonesia, and the cinnamon that trickled in through a long and mysterious supply chain. He would buy the raw, crystalline chunks of camphor from Borneo and the intensely fragrant pods of musk from the Himalayas, commodities so valuable they were worth many times their weight in gold. He would also have access to the finished goods of the Islamic world's advanced industries, finely crafted glassware from Syria, intricate metalwork from Mosul, and the advanced pharmacological compounds, the balms, elixirs, and theriacs prepared by the great physicians and alchemists of Baghdad. The Radhanite merchant assembling his westbound cargo was, in essence, curating a collection of global luxuries. He was a one-man trading company with a truly global perspective, something that no other individual merchant of his time could claim. He understood the supply chains that began in the forests of Germany, the mountains of Afghanistan, the jungles of Indonesia, and the workshops of China. And he understood the desires of the elites at both ends of the world. His unique position, his neutrality, and his trust network allowed him to operate at the single most important intersection point of the global economy. He was the man who stood at the terminus of the Silk Road and, instead of seeing the end of the line, saw a connection. He took the immense wealth and diversity of the Asian and Islamic markets, consolidated it, and then single-handedly extended its reach another 2,000 miles to the west. He had plugged the emerging economy of Europe into the ancient, powerful, and wealthy engine of the East. After a long and perilous journey, the Radhanite merchant, his caravan or ship now laden with the treasures of the East, would arrive back in the land of the Franks. Here, he entered a world that was the mirror opposite of the one he had just left. He traded the sun-drenched, cash-rich, urbanized world of the Abbasid Caliphate for the cool, forested, and largely cashless world of the Carolingian Empire. He left behind the bustling, multicultural souks of Baghdad and entered the rough-hewn, timber-built halls of the Frankish aristocracy. To the lords and kings of this world, the Radhanite was a figure of immense importance, a rare and almost magical conduit to a wider, richer, and more sophisticated universe. He was not just a trader. He was the indispensable purveyor of the very symbols of power and legitimacy upon which their rule was built. His role in the West was not just to sell goods, but to service the deep, structural needs of a feudal society that craved the prestige that only the exotic could confer. The Carolingian court, whether under the great Charlemagne or his less formidable successors like Louis the Pious, was the absolute center of power and the ultimate destination for the Radhanites' eastern cargo. The Carolingian elite, the dukes, counts, bishops, and the imperial family itself dwelt in a state of profound material contradiction. They were masters of vast tracts of land and commanded the loyalty of thousands of warriors. They were military and political giants. Yet by the standards of Baghdad or Constantinople, they lived in a state of rustic simplicity. Their wealth was illiquid, tied up in land and agricultural surplus. Their halls were drafty, their food was monotonous, and their clothing was functional wool and linen. This created a powerful and insatiable demand for any object that could visibly and tangibly distinguish them from their lesser vassals and from one another. In a society where power was personal and constantly performed, the display of rare and exotic luxury was not a frivolous indulgence, it was a fundamental tool of statecraft. The Radhanite merchant who arrived at the court in Aachen or Ingelheim was the key to satisfying this demand. He was the exclusive dealer in the raw materials of prestige. His most important commodity, the one that overshadowed all others, was silk. In the rigid, hierarchical world of the Carolingian court, the right to wear or even to touch silk was a privilege fiercely guarded by the highest echelons of power. It was the cloth of royalty, its shimmering texture and vibrant, exotic dyes a world away from the coarse fabrics of local production. A king like Charles the Bald would use bolts of Radhanite-supplied silk to forge his political world. He would wear it himself to project an aura of imperial majesty. He would gift it to his most powerful dukes and counts to reward their loyalty, a gesture far more potent than a gift of land. He would use it to wrap the holy relics in his chapel, sanctifying his rule by associating this otherworldly fabric with the divine. And he would use it in diplomacy, sending it as a gift to rival rulers, like the Anglo-Saxon kings, to signal his superior status. The Radhanites, by controlling the supply of this essential political commodity, held a position of quiet but immense influence. Beyond silk, they supplied the entire sensory world of the court. The great Carolingian feasts, designed to display the ruler's wealth and generosity, were transformed by the Radhanites as cargo. Their spices, the pepper, cloves, and cinnamon, were so rare and valuable that they were often kept under lock and key in the royal treasury, doled out by the peppercorn to season the roasted meats and spiced wines that were the centerpiece of these events. The presence of these powerful, exotic flavors was a clear and unambiguous statement of the host's wealth and connections. The air in the halls, often thick with the smell of wood smoke and unwashed bodies, was sweetened and purified by the burning of incense and the application of perfumes like musk and camphor, also supplied by the Radhanites. These were not just pleasant smells. They were a form of olfactory warfare against the brutish reality of the age, a way of creating a refined, almost sacred, space around the person of the king. Because of their indispensable role, the Radhanites were granted a level of protection and privilege that was extraordinary for a non-Christian group. Charlemagne and his successors issued royal charters or diplomas that took these Jewish merchants under their direct personal protection. These charters granted them remarkable freedoms. They were allowed to travel unmolested throughout the empire, a right denied to most. They were exempted from many of the tolls and taxes that burdened other merchants. Crucially, they were granted the right to trade in slaves, a recognition of the immense importance of this grim commerce to the imperial economy. They were even granted the right to have their legal disputes settled according to their own Jewish law, a testament to their special status as a people apart, a nation within the nation, whose commercial function was too important to be interfered with. They were, in essence, a protected class, the king's merchants, whose utility to the crown outweighed the religious prejudices of the day. This protected status allowed them to operate with a degree of freedom that was astonishing. They established communities and warehouses in key trading cities along the great rivers of the empire, like the Rhine and the Rhone, in cities like Mainz, Verdun, Lyon, and Arles. These became the western hubs of their global network, the places where the goods from the east were consolidated, stored, and then distributed to the courts of the aristocracy. This was also where the westbound cargo was assembled. It was in these cities that the Radhanites would meet with the agents of Frankish lords to purchase Slavic captives or deal with armorers to acquire the prized swords of the Rhineland, preparing their goods for the long and profitable journey back to the east. The relationship between the Radhanites and their Carolingian patrons was, therefore, one of perfect symbiotic need. The kings and emperors needed the Radhanites to supply them with the essential symbols of their power and prestige. Without the silks, spices, and perfumes, a king was just a landowner with a bigger army. It was these exotic goods that elevated him, that gave his court a touch of the quasi-divine, and that provided him with the currency of high-level diplomacy. The Radhanites, in turn, needed the protection of the king to operate safely and profitably in a world that was often deeply hostile to them. The royal charter was their shield, the king's greed their guarantee of safe passage. They were the secret brokers who understood the deep psychological and political economy of the age, who knew that the true foundation of a king's power was not just his castle wall, but the shimmering bolt of Chinese silk he wore upon his shoulders. The sacks of spice and bolts of silk that the Radhanites carried were only their most visible cargo. Tucked within their caravans and ship holds, carried in their memories and in the sealed letters they transported, was a flow of goods that was far less tangible but in many ways far more valuable. The Radhanites did not just trade in commodities. They were the primary conduits for the transfer of information, technology, and financial innovation in their age. their unique, globe-spanning network, which allowed them to move with unparalleled freedom between the great, sealed-off civilizations of Christendom and Islam, made them more than just merchants. They were the nervous system of the 9th century world, the carriers of its secret messages, its new ideas, and its most advanced economic techniques. To see the Radhanites only as traders of luxury goods is to miss the profound and lasting impact of their unseen cargo. The most fundamental of these invisible goods was information. In a world of slow travel and immense distances, reliable, up-to-date information was a commodity more precious than gold. Kings and caliphs had their own systems of messengers and spies, but these were official, politically biased, and limited to the frontiers of their own empires. The Radhanites represented something entirely different, a private, global intelligence network. A Radhanite merchant leaving the court of Louis the Pious in Francia would have first-hand knowledge of the political climate, the state of the harvests, and the military preparations of the Carolingian Empire. When he arrived in Cordoba, this information would be of immense strategic value to the Umayyad Emir. As he continued on to Baghdad, he carried with him a mental map of the entire Mediterranean world. He knew which ports were safe, which local lords were in rebellion, where a drought had ruined the crops, and where a new plague was rumored to be spreading. This information was not gathered for espionage in the military sense. It was essential business intelligence. To be a successful long-distance trader was to be a master of risk management, and risk was a function of information. But in sharing this information within their own closed network, the Radhanites became the most knowledgeable and well-informed people on the planet. Their scattered communities functioned like a global news agency. A letter from the Jewish community in Mainz could be carried by a Radhanite merchant to the community in Cairo, containing news that would travel far faster and more reliably than any official channel. This made them indispensable not just as traders, but as advisors and informal diplomats. A caliph or a king who wanted to understand the true state of affairs in a distant land would have found no better source than the Radhanite merchant who had just returned from there. They were the living, breathing embodiment of a global news service, the secret carriers of the world's most valuable political and economic data. Beyond immediate intelligence, the Radhanites were also the primary vectors for the slow, quiet transfer of technology and ideas. While the great scientific and philosophical texts were being formally translated in Baghdad and later in Toledo, the Radhanites' trade routes facilitated a more practical, hands-on form of transmission. New technologies and agricultural products would travel in their wake. For example, it was likely through these Jewish merchant networks that the knowledge of new industrial and agricultural processes moved from the sophisticated Islamic world to Europe. Concepts like papermaking, which the Abbasids had learned from Chinese prisoners of war, may have made their first journey to the West in the minds and sample cases of Radhanite traders. New crops that had been introduced to the Islamic world from India and Asia, such as citrus fruits, sugarcane, and new strains of cotton likely found their way into Al-Andalus and Sicily, and from there to the rest of Europe via these same commercial pathways. This transfer was not limited to technology. It also included cultural and intellectual ideas. The Radhanites were a bridge between the great medical schools of the East and the more primitive practices of the West, long before the formal translation of the canon of medicine. They would have carried not just the raw materials for drugs, like camphor and musk, but also the knowledge of how to compound and use them, bringing the advanced pharmacology of Baghdad to the physicians who served the Carolingian elite. They were also a conduit for mathematical ideas. While Al-Khwarizmi was formalizing the science of algebra in Baghdad, the practical application of the new, efficient Hindu-Arabic numerals, particularly the concept of zero, would have been an immense advantage for any international merchant. It is almost certain that the Radhanites were among the first to use these new numbers in their complex, multi-currency accounting, introducing these revolutionary concepts to their agents and bankers in Europe on a practical, commercial level long before they were a subject of formal academic study. Perhaps their most sophisticated and influential invisible cargo was the suite of advanced financial instruments they developed to manage their global enterprise. Transporting vast quantities of gold and silver across thousands of miles of dangerous territory was a merchant's worst nightmare. The risk of shipwreck, banditry, or official confiscation was immense. To mitigate this risk, the Radhanites, in conjunction with their network of Jewish bankers, geopolitics, in the Islamic world, became the pioneers of international finance, creating systems to move value without moving metal. The primary tool was an early form of the letter of credit. A Radhanite merchant in Baghdad could deposit his profits, 1,000 silver dirhams, with a trusted Jewish banker there. The banker would then provide him with a letter, written in Hebrew, which was essentially a promissory note. The merchant could then travel, unburdened by the heavy and dangerous coins, to another major city like Fustat in Egypt. Upon arrival, he would present the letter to the correspondent of the Baghdad banker, who would then pay him out the 1,000 dirhams from his own local reserves. This was a revolutionary innovation. It was a system built entirely on the private, trust-based network of the diaspora. No king or caliph could offer such a service. It was a private, international banking system that was fast, secure, and almost entirely invisible to the outside world. This ability to move capital fluidly across political and religious boundaries was a superpower. It allowed the Radhanites to finance complex, multi-stage journeys, to pay agents, to buy protection, and to manage their profits with a level of sophistication that was centuries ahead of their Christian European counterparts. This system was the true secret to the scale of their operations. While a Genoese or Venetian merchant of the same era was still largely limited to carrying his profits in a chest, a Radhanite could move a fortune across the world with a slip of paper. This unseen cargo, this mastery of financial abstraction, was perhaps the most advanced and powerful technology they possessed. It was the invisible engine that drove the entire visible network of silks and spices, swords and slaves. For a golden century, from roughly the early 9th to the mid-10th, the Radhanites were the undisputed masters of global trade, the secret brokers who held the keys to the world economy. Their four great routes were the arteries of a continent, their trust network a commercial superpower, their access to the courts of kings and caliphs unparalleled. And then, from the pages of history, they seemed to vanish. The detailed, confident description by Ibn Khordadbeh in the 9th century is followed by a few scattered mentions in the 10th, and by the 11th, the term Radhanite has disappeared from the records entirely. A network of such power and sophistication does not simply evaporate overnight. What happened to this invisible empire? The mystery of the Radhanites' disappearance is as compelling as the story of their rise. They were not conquered, they were not exiled, they were not destroyed. The Radhanite network faded from history for a more complex and subtle reason. The world changed, and the unique, fragile niche that had made them so indispensable ceased to exist. They were, in the end, victims of their own success, architects of a more connected world that no longer required their specialized services. The first great shift that undermined the Radhanite monopoly was the political fragmentation of their most important sphere of operation. The Abbasid Caliphate, the unified, monolithic empire that had provided the stable, wealthy, and secure eastern terminus for their trade routes, began to crumble from within. In the early 10th century, a rival Shia dynasty, the Fatimids, broke away and established their own caliphate in North Africa, eventually conquering Egypt and founding the new capital of Cairo. This shattered the political and religious unity of the Islamic world, creating a new, powerful, and often hostile superpower in the central Mediterranean. At the same time, the eastern provinces of the Caliphate in Persia and Central Asia fell under the control of independent Samanid and other dynasties. Baghdad itself fell into a period of decline, its power eclipsed by new centers of gravity. For the Radhanites, this was a catastrophic disruption. Their old, predictable roots were now fractured. A journey that had once required navigating the politics of only two great powers, the Carolingians and the Abbasids, now involved crossing the borders of half a dozen smaller, competing, and often warring states. The political chessboard they had mastered had been overturned, its rules rewritten. While their diaspora network still functioned, the risks and costs of every journey multiplied. The second, and perhaps most decisive, change came from the West. While the Islamic world was fragmenting, Christian Europe was experiencing a commercial awakening, a process the Radhanites themselves had helped to stimulate. From the 10th century onwards, a new and aggressive breed of merchant adventurers began to emerge from the burgeoning city-states of Italy. The merchants of Amalfi and later, more powerfully, Venice and Genoa were no longer content to let a third party handle the lucrative Eastern trade. Backed by their own growing naval power and a fierce civic ambition, they began to challenge the Muslim dominance of the Mediterranean and build their own direct trade routes to the Levant. The Venetians, in particular, were brilliant and ruthless strategists. They established their own trading colonies in Constantinople and, later, in the ports of Egypt and Syria. They were Christians, but their true faith was commerce. They were willing to make deals, sign treaties, and, if necessary, go to war to carve out their own share of the spice and silk trade. This created a direct and fatal competition for the Radhanites. A Carolingian lord who wanted silk no longer had to rely on the discreet, overland services of a Radhanite merchant. He could now buy it more directly and perhaps more cheaply from a Venetian trader who had brought it by sea from the east. These new Italian merchants had advantages the Radhanites lacked. They were not a small, scattered diaspora, but the representatives of powerful, militarized city-states that could protect their trade routes with war fleets. They were also operating from within Christendom, giving them a political and cultural legitimacy that the Radhanites, for all their protections, could never fully achieve. They were the new insiders. They systematically began to cut out the middlemen. The rise of the Italian maritime republics was the single greatest blow to the Radhanite business model. The secret brokers were no longer the only ones who knew the way. Further disruptions came from the north and the east. The northern land route, which had run through the lands of the Khazars, was catastrophically severed in the late 10th century when the Kievan Rus, under their ruler Sviatoslav, sacked and destroyed the Khazar capital of Itul. This powerful, stabilizing trading empire, which had served as a vital gateway for the Radhanites, was wiped from the map, plunging the entire region into chaos and making the overland journey to Central Asia exponentially more dangerous. At the same time, the final terminus of their trade in China also slammed shut. The Tang dynasty, which had been a stable and welcoming market for foreign merchants, collapsed in 907, leading to a long period of instability that made the overland Silk Road all but impassable for a time. Every one of the four great Radhanite routes was now either broken, bypassed, or significantly more dangerous than it had been a century earlier. So what became of the Radhanites themselves? They did not vanish from the earth. The Jewish diaspora, of course, continued to thrive and play a vital role in the global economy. What disappeared was the specific, temporary niche that the Radhanites, as a class of globe-spanning, neutral long-distance brokers, had so brilliantly exploited. As the world changed, they adapted. Many likely integrated into the new, more localized trade networks. A Radhanite family that had once managed a route from Lyon to Baghdad might now focus on the more regional, but still profitable, trade between Christian Spain and Muslim North Africa. Others likely transitioned from merchants into the role that would become central to the Jewish economic function in the High Middle Ages: finance. As the Italian merchants came to dominate the physical trade of goods, Jewish communities, with their ancient trust network and mastery of credit instruments, became the great bankers and financiers of the new European economy. The Radhanites, therefore, were a product of a very specific historical moment. They thrived in the geopolitical gap, the brief but crucial period when the two great civilizations of the world were too hostile to trade directly, but too codependent to live without each other's goods. They built a bridge across that gap. But their very success in connecting the world and stimulating its economic growth helped to create the conditions that would render that bridge obsolete. The new, more aggressive, and more integrated world of the 11th century, with its rising Italian sea powers and its looming crusades, had no room for a neutral broker. The Radhanite story is a powerful lesson in the rise and fall of a commercial niche. They were the masters of a secret economy, the quiet heroes of a connected dark age. They faded from view not because they failed, but because the world they had helped to create had learned to trade for itself. Our investigation has revealed the hidden wiring of a supposedly dark and disconnected age, a global economic network commanded by a mysterious and uniquely positioned group of merchants, the Radhanites. We have argued that in the 9th century, a world fractured by the ideological and military hostility between the two great superpowers of Christendom and the Islamic Caliphate, these Jewish traders became the sole, indispensable conduit for global commerce. They were the secret brokers who overcame the Great Divide, their success built not on armies or territory, but on the power of a trust-based diaspora network that gave them reliable partners and a shared legal framework in every major city from France to the frontiers of China. We have traced the 4 great, globe-spanning routes described by Ibn Khordadbeh, a strategic portfolio of land and sea options that allowed the Radhanites to navigate a perilous and ever-changing political landscape with unparalleled adaptability. We have catalogued their precious cargo, demonstrating how they mastered the art of arbitrage on a global scale. They channeled the raw materials and human chattel of a resource-rich but luxury-poor Europe Frankish swords, northern furs, and Slavic slaves to the voracious markets of the East. In return, they funneled the sophisticated luxuries of Asia and the Islamic world silk, spices, and perfumes back to the power-hungry courts of the West, supplying the very symbols of legitimacy that underpinned feudal rule. Beyond physical goods, we have shown that the Radhanites were the carriers of an unseen cargo of information, technology, and financial innovation, operating as a private intelligence service and pioneering the use of credit instruments centuries ahead of their European counterparts. Finally, we have solved the mystery of their disappearance, arguing that the Radhanite network did not collapse, but was rendered obsolete by the very forces of economic change it had helped to set in motion. The rise of powerful new trading powers like the Italian city-states and the fragmentation of their key markets eliminated the unique niche for a neutral, third-party broker. The Radhanites did not fail, they simply faded away as the world they had secretly connected learned to trade for itself, leaving behind the stunning but fleeting legacy of a truly global network in a supposedly dark age. The story of the Radhanites offers a profound and necessary correction to our understanding of the past. It stands as a powerful counter-narrative to the simplistic and often repeated story of a clash of civilizations, the idea of a world forever defined by the intractable hostility between monolithic blocks of faith. The Radhanites are the living proof that even in an age of profound ideological division, the pragmatic and persistent human need for connection, for commerce, will always find a way. Their network was a testament to the fact that the real history of the world is often written not in the blood of its great battles, but in the ink of its ledgers and the dust of its trade routes. They demonstrate a timeless truth. Where there is a wall, there will always be those who find a way to secretly and profitably pass goods over it. Their legacy is not written in stone. The Radhanites built no great monuments, they founded no lasting kingdoms, and they left behind no epic literature of their own. Theirs was an invisible empire, and its legacy is, therefore, equally invisible but no less profound. It can be found in the DNA of our interconnected world. They were a powerful, early example of a decentralized, non-state network proving more adaptable, more resilient, and more knowledgeable than the rigid, hierarchical empires they served. In an age of lumbering giants, they were swift, intelligent, and moved with a purpose that no single ruler could fully comprehend. They were the masters of information, the pioneers of international finance, and the living embodiment of the principle that the broker who stands between two worlds holds a unique and formidable power. The Radhanites remind us that the most significant forces in history are often the most hidden. Beneath the grand narratives of kings, caliphs, and popes, there is always the secret wiring of the world, a web of commerce and communication that makes everything else possible. For a crucial century, the Radhanites were that wiring. They were the synapses that allowed the two separate halves of the world's brain to communicate, ensuring that the global economic organism, while wounded, did not die. Their story is a vital lesson in the temporary nature of any commercial advantage. They mastered a perfect niche, but the world changed, and their niche vanished. They were a bridge, and the very act of their success in connecting the world helped to create the conditions that would eventually render that specific bridge obsolete. Their tale is ultimately one of quiet, pragmatic heroism. It is a story of adaptation, of survival, and of the remarkable power of a trust-based network to overcome the barriers of prejudice and politics. While empires postured and armies clashed, the Radhanites were engaged in the patient, difficult, and profoundly civilizing work of keeping the world connected. They prove that history is often shaped not by the loud pronouncements of those on thrones, but by the quiet, persistent, and indispensable work of the broker.